My name is Alan Robbins. I'm a partner with DevX and Global Head of Membership and Alliance. I'm pleased to be hosting our Google Hangout today, entitled From Inputs to Outcomes, Redefining Meaningful Gender Integration. It's part of the She Builds initiative that we put together in partnership with Programmatic, Creative Associates, DFID, JBS International, Millennium Challenge Corporation, UNOPS, and Creative Associates. Now, I'm pleased to be here with three great panelists that are going to be talking about these issues. One of whom, the first one, is Josefina Coutura, who is the Associate Director at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And she's involved in making sure that gender is integrated into the MCC's programs, and let her get into a bit about what that means. Second, I have Mary Fontaine, who is the Gender Practice Lead at JBS International, which is a major implementer of programs for development agencies, particularly USAID. And then the third is Sunita Hathiyanthara, if I got that right, who is Project Manager for Sustainable Project Management Practice Group at the UN Office of Project Services, UNOPS, based out of Copenhagen. Now, rather than doing a full integration for each of you, maybe I will just start, Mary, by asking you a little bit about your work in this area and maybe a bit about the work that JBS International does, just to start things off.
Sure. Nice to meet you. And I've been involved with gender since, I guess we would call it the modern wave of feminism in the late 60s and early 70s. I have a master's degree in international women's studies. I wrote and taught one of the first women's studies courses ever in the world in 1971, I believe it was. And I've worked internationally in gender for 30 years. My geographic specialization is in the Near East, the Middle East, and Central Asia. I spent 4 years in Iran, 5 in Egypt, 3 in Pakistan, 3 in Bangladesh, and 5 in Afghanistan. I just got back a year ago from 5 years with USAID in Afghanistan. I've also worked in East and West Africa and the Balkans and Eastern Europe and the Caribbean. So I'm a bit of a scholar, I would say, because I read constantly. I read the research on gender constantly. The reason I do that is because I found that gender is not taken seriously as a field, as a professional, legitimate field. Instead, it's sort of looked at as, well, just use common sense, when in fact there is a strong and growing body of knowledge that increases daily. So I never like to say anything that is quote-unquote Mary's opinion unless I preface it as such. I want to be able to back up everything I say with chapter and verse, because I believe this is what's going to give gender the gravitas that it absolutely needs today for us to move forward. Now, I came to JBS International from USAID in Afghanistan for a number of reasons, and one of them is that JBS, well, first of all, JBS is owned and run by 2 women, co-CEOs, and it has a staff of, I believe, 60–65% female, which is very unusual. It's a very different feel here. We do have an affirmative action program for men. That's a joke. JBS is it's a compassionate company, and yet it's a scholarly, evidence-based program, so that while our activities are very much related to human rights and improving the social condition, everything we do is grounded in social science or even regular science and in art. So it's sort of like me. I thought the company was a good fit with me, and I thought I was a good fit with the company for that reason. I'm astonished, frankly, by the creative minds around me and the amazing ability they have to analyze very complicated issues and come up with solutions that that can be adapted from one context to another. So I think that about says it all, unless you would like to know any more.
That's great. Well, we'll get into that. We'll get into that. But Josefina, maybe just a few words about your background and the work that you're doing at MCC in this space.
Hi, thank you. I'm very glad to be here and participate in this session. My name is Josefina Coutura, and I work with the Millennium Challenge Corporation. This is my 4th year with the institution, where throughout that entire time I have focused on social and gender issues at the MCC. We work in a small space in a number of countries and take the matter very seriously. Prior to working at the MCC, I was at the World Bank Group, working mostly on gender and private sector development issues for a number of years. And what attracted me to the MCC was how very seriously the institution took its focus on gender and how it took it from rhetoric to actually really meaningfully integrating a gender focus throughout the design and implementation of its projects. And then I look forward to telling you more about this later as we start the discussion.
Great, thanks. And Sunitha, perhaps you can give us a bit of an introduction?
Yes. Hi, I'm Sunitha. I'm a project manager with the United Nations Office for Project Services. I'm not a gender expert, but the background is I've been working as a project manager and various project roles. I was in Afghanistan earlier with UNOPS. This is my 5th year here. And we operate a lot of projects all around the world, especially in post-conflict countries, in a very male-dominated sectors like infrastructure, procurement, and project management. So this is something that we face every day, the challenge of incorporating gender in a so-called very masculine sectors. And I have, in Afghanistan, I have worked with a couple of gender sensitive projects where we try to mainstream certain aspects into rural roads. Right now, I'm a project manager with the sustainability program in UNOPS, based out of our headquarters in Copenhagen, where we are trying to encourage all the project managers and project developers across the world to take this seriously and incorporate into their project proposals as well as into their ongoing projects. So we recently launched the Gender Mainstreaming Toolkit, where I was a lead author. And we are also trying at a corporate level to align ourselves and meet the requirements of UN SWAP, which is the United Nations System-Wide Action Plan. And, yeah,
great.
Thanks.
Sunitha, let's, you mentioned this Gender Mainstreaming Toolkit. I think it would be great maybe to keep you on the spotlight here and just ask you sort of what are the highlights that you found from this toolkit and how can other development organizations really learn and benefit from this?
Yes, one of the first things that we looked around is if there is any existing good material out there which we can start using immediately. And what we realized is there is not one solution which fits everyone. So we had to tailor it to suit the kind of projects we did, which is unlike a lot of other development projects you see. We deal more with construction, hardcore infrastructure projects, and also mine action, which takes up the majority of our portfolio. And this is a kind of sector which was not traditionally addressed with the various toolkits which was available outside. So we had to start with something which a normal, not normal I would say, a person with no gender background can still understand. We wanted to demystify the topic so that even someone like an HR officer can still understand what it meant and how to mainstream it into the recruitment process. We wanted to make it simple for a procurement officer to see how they can mainstream gender into their procurement cycle. So the whole idea was to keep it as simple as possible and to demystify and take out the jargons wherever we can. So that was the overall objective, and we achieved this based on the feedback that I get, that it is understandable to someone with no prior gender background or social science background. We have tried to keep all the jargons to the minimum and to explain it in layman's term, so I can say, and try not as an academic exercise, but more of a practical tool that they can use in a day-to-day feedback. And we started this by incorporating the various lessons learned and case studies that we had around the world. So we started collecting the good best practices and the case studies that we have done all around the world, and we compiled it into the various cycles of project management which we follow. So, for instance, we follow Prince2, which is a globally accepted project management technique. So, in our case, we had to tailor the gender mainstreaming aspect to fit in with the Prince2 themes and the stages, so that the project managers can understand what it means to say how to mainstream gender into the initiation stage, for instance. So what we did was to keep it simple as much as possible so that someone with an interest in gender can understand and doesn't necessarily have to be an expert. And so this was complemented with case studies, checklists, templates, and guidance materials.
Great. Well, sort of on a similar topic, I think that there's a difference between, or maybe there's not always a difference, but there can be a difference between doing development projects that target women and girls, and then the idea of integrating gender as part of a successful development project. I think a lot of the conversation now is, obviously there's still projects targeting women and girls, and there will continue to be, but a lot of the conversation now is how do you actually integrate this into broader projects. Josefina, maybe I can ask you a little bit about sort of what's the difference between the two, and what are you seeing the difference in your work?
Well, I think at the NCC's work, for a large share of it consists of really meaningfully integrating a gender focus across the project, regardless of what they are. And just like at UN Ops, what Sunita was just talking about, a lot of our projects are very infrastructure heavy and not in those sectors that are traditionally associated with women, such as health and education, and where the field has done a good job of integrating gender perspectives. And so gender integration there has not been necessarily an easy path. And yet at the same time, there have been some activities that have focused specifically on women and specifically addressed gender inequity challenges that are identified as such during our compact development process. Our best example of that would be Lesotho, where probably the community as a whole is aware of the NCC conditioning its compact with Lesotho on the passage of a law that would change women's legal status so that they're no longer legal minors upon marriage. Since then, there have been other activities that have focused and targeted specifically women. Indonesia would be another example where the compact sets aside $5 million for addressing gender inequalities at the policy and institutional levels across our activities. And yet still the bulk of the work is to really meaningfully integrate a gender perspective into all the projects that we fund. And for me personally, and I understand also for my institution, both are crucial. On the one hand, there are specific challenges facing women and girls that merit attention, and yet at the same time, the majority of funding as a whole will not be going towards these issues. It will be going towards larger projects. So at the MCC, the vast majority of our project funding goes towards very infrastructure-heavy activities, and therefore it's really crucial that we have a gender focus within those, so that, for example, through our projects we can create employment opportunities for women in construction or find other meaningful opportunities for them to be involved in activities and sectors where they traditionally aren't. And so I just believe that both are crucial.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that, Josefina. And maybe, Mary, I think you might have some great insights on this question as well.
Yes, I have found throughout my work that the question about whether or not to focus on women-specific programs or to integrate men and women together into programs is a moot question. You have to do both. It really isn't an either-or. It depends very much on the context, doesn't it? Where women cannot work alongside of men, then you really must try to slowly move in that direction and here's an interesting question, equal or equitable opportunities. And that's another thing I hope we get to talk about. At the same time, where women have a lot of catching up to do, where they are nowhere near the level of sophistication as men are in a particular area, I think there too you need to think about women-specific programs, at least in the short term, until a critical mass, or at least a quorum, if you will, of women are ready to, to learn alongside of men. Because putting a woman with a disadvantaged background in the same room with a man who has had all the opportunities, it doesn't work, and it brings the man down, his learning, and it frustrates the woman, and in fact, I think, lowers her self-esteem. So you have to really know your context, and it will vary greatly, not only from country to country, but of course from target group to target group. It will vary by age, maybe by ethnic group, by disability, by marital status, by whether or not children are involved. Practically every factor that can be disaggregated is going to have some say about whether or not men and women can truly be integrated fairly into one project. Now, that's the ideal, but if men are, up here in terms of knowledge and skills, and women are down here much lower, then you first have to have a catch-up phase, I believe. It's also important then to get to the women who have had an opportunity to develop capacities and skills to work alongside men, and to start opening those doors for their sisters who are working their way up. And I think one of the things that we have to start doing as an international community is to ensure that women who are in positions, increasingly in positions of decision-making and resource allocation, are able to know exactly what the needs are at the grassroots and among the women who have not had those opportunities. I would like to see these women go and live in the village for a while and find out exactly what it's like. So therefore, the women in the village can have their voices heard through the representatives at the top, if you will, or even in the middle, and vice versa. The women in the grassroots hear not only about women's issues, but also about issues at large. So integration is the ideal, and when you do have that opportunity, I think it's then extremely important that the project manager ensure that men who are accustomed to privilege and to some sort of feeling of superiority, there has to be a zero tolerance policy toward that kind of behavior in a mixed group. Fortunately, women who reach that stage are clearly very strong women and have had to overcome quite a lot to get there, and they can really handle themselves, particularly if there's a critical mass of women in a particular group.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and Sunita, perhaps you have some thoughts on this. And you mentioned before that UNOPS works a lot in sectors that are sort of male-heavy in terms of the construction and other things. the toolkit that you created was ways to make it so that you're integrating gender even in these sort of male-heavy areas. But as Mary just mentioned, a lot of this might have to do with more longer-term things. You know, to get construction workers, and that's not something you can just decide one day. But maybe I'm putting words in your mouth. But maybe it's not something that you just decide one day. But it might take some time. So through your work and through your toolkit, are you looking at some of these longer-term things of how to get more women to a place where they can sort of be equal in that room and not have to worry about some of these longer-term challenges?
Yes, as Mary mentioned, we have to try to do both because, as I said, UNOPS operates all around the world, and the gender equality indexes vary from countries to countries. So for certain countries like Haiti, where we don't have an issue of women and men working together, we try to push for mixed gender themes. Whereas the project that we run in Afghanistan, it's culturally a big no-no. You can't do it. So in those cases, we had to come out with interventions specifically targeting women, and we had to create women's only group to promote entrepreneurship and come up with ways to engage them in the project activities, which you cannot traditionally, which you cannot do just like any other country. So it is a delicate balance between the both, and it's very, very context specific. And it also important in the countries like Afghanistan or a bit more conservative culture. It is men become a really vital stakeholder who needs to be managed for the interventions to be sustainable. So in one of the projects that we did, this was in Mazar-e-Sharif, which is northern Afghanistan. It was not usual for women to come out and work. So when the project manager there had to start engaging women, the first thing he had to do was to go talk to the husbands. He had to convince the mullahs, who are the religious leaders, and he also had to convince the shuras, who are the community leaders. So once he convinced these three very male-dominated, stakeholder group as well as men, it became much more easier because once these key stakeholders' concerns were addressed, it became much more easier to engage these women, and in turn, they were also cooperated to the extent they offered security for these women because it was also a concern there. So what worked there was to make sure that you bring in all three, in this case, three vital stakeholder groups, to make sure that whatever interventions we were coming up with was really sustainable. Similarly, in one of our projects in South Sudan, where we were building 14 schools for an Italian-funded project, one of the reasons why girls don't show up is because of harassment by boys. And for this, we had to come out with ways to address this issue and talk to boys and sensitize them to the fact that this is not acceptable. And this was done in various methods, from orientation workshops to inspiring girls to stand up with a She magazine, which was a community-led girls club magazine. So I completely agree with Mary, and it should be a mix, and it's very context-specific and needs to be seen what will work where, because there is not a single solution which will work everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Great. I want to. We had a few questions coming in from the DevX audience on that we were asked to ask, and I think this might be an interesting point because you've spoken a bit about Afghanistan. Maybe I'll ask Mary. I'll go back to you here, and on this one because you've also worked in Afghanistan. But this question is from the audience. What are your recommendations on creating real opportunities for women and girls in post-conflict and conflict-plagued countries? Here's the bit of controversy here. For example, how do we keep hope alive, this is the question, and opportunities flowing to the women and girls in Afghanistan once the U.S. and NATO forces withdraw by the end of 2014?
Well, that is the $64,000 question, isn't it? Of course, no one knows the answer to that, really, but I will say that the pressure and support from the international community is absolutely critical for this. That's number one. Secondly, in the last 12 years, the international community has enabled a pretty strong and active network of women's organizations and advocacy groups and human rights groups who are not going to sit back and allow freedoms to be eliminated wholesale for women. There's going to be struggle from within. There's going to be, and it's going to be public. They know how to go public now, and so I think that if there, well, every time there has been a setback in the last couple of months, there has been an outcry from within the country and from all over the world. And I think people are prepared for this, preparing for the worst, getting a blueprint together for, you know, for the worst case scenario, and that may even involve getting women out of the country, and now that's very worst case, all the way up to, of course, how to continue to grow what has already been built. The genie is out of the bottle in Afghanistan when it comes to women. There are many strong women, and this, you know, and they're not going to leave. They're committed. They love their country, and that fortunately, with a youth population of 70% or whatever it is, something like that, under 30, we have a larger and larger number of young people, men and women, young men and women, who are media savvy, who understand the world around them much better than they did even 10 or 12 years ago. They have influences from the international community having been there. They see women doing things that they haven't seen women do before. And I think that there's a much more openness and awareness of the importance of equality. Of course, there's the other side too, but we have a very strong youth group that I think can help lead the way. And finally, I think that more and more women have been able to obtain an education. Now we have, I think it's something like 40,000 women in universities or technical and vocational training institutes or private universities or some sort of, certainly who have graduated from high school. And once you teach someone to read, you cannot take that away. And that's empowering in and of itself, isn't it? So we have a lot of, there's a lot with which to work to keep the gains that women have made. We're going to see, I think, a slippery slope. I think we're going to see some steps backwards. I think we're going to see then, you know, a push forward again. I don't think it's going to be easy, but I do think it's going to be possible. Afghanistan's not going away. It's going to be there. We cannot say that it's a lost cause and walk away. We have said we will not abandon you, and we've made that abundantly clear. And so with that pledge and that commitment, I think that we can make it work regardless of what happens there.
Yeah, and Josefina, there's of course economic opportunity is a huge part of any of this, and I know this is an area that you've worked in quite a bit, and MCC works in quite a bit. Are there any particular programs or types of projects that you think are particularly useful for, helpful for giving women economic opportunities that you've worked on?
Well, the MCC's mission is poverty reduction through economic growth. So by default, all the projects that we have such a rationale and are designed to create economic opportunities. Now, our job is through our agenda policy, our agenda milestones, operational procedures, staffing, accountability, and so on, to make sure that that actually happens. So I could give you a number of examples of projects where we have done a decent job of creating economic opportunities for women. For me in particular, given the large focus on infrastructure in our projects, one of my pet causes at the institution has been creating economic opportunities for women in these sectors through, for example, jobs in construction. A project that I just visited last month and that I'm particularly proud of is our Kalahi SIDS project in the Philippines. That is a community-driven development project which allows communities to propose interventions for funding, and through MCC's funding has really integrated a much more meaningful gender perspective than had been previously the case. We have the projects traditionally fund, the communities propose what the projects will fund, but they mostly end up funding small farm-to-market roads, small types of infrastructure, a health facility, a bridge, and so on. And through our intervention, and even though they have done a decent job of involving women as community volunteers in the process of determining what the community priorities will be, somehow or another, these priorities that are eventually funded are always the same priorities. They're not necessarily the priorities that when we speak to the women directly, we hear being the most important issues for them. In the Philippines, for example, that might be maternal health. And so whereas a community might fund a project such as a small health clinic, it will not take it to the next stage and consider it will fund the infrastructure, but may not necessarily fund an intervention to address the capacity needs of the healthcare staff, or to build, or to fund even the purchase of needed medical equipment. And so what our project has done for about 3-4 years now has been to address these kinds of issues. And it's been, we also set aside a complimentary $1 million for women to propose projects that will specifically address their needs. And I just visited last month the pilot projects that have been implemented with this funding. And one of the 2 pilot projects is for non-traditional skills for women. So women in this remote area of the Philippines were trained to be plumbers and welders. And it was just amazing to visit these women and speak to them and see how, first of all, it was such a big mindset change for them in their lives to even consider having such a job, and the small intra-household battles that they had to have with their husbands regarding why are you being trained to have a job like that? That is not a job that is acceptable in our community, and the strength that these women had to show to eventually go through the skills training, and then how going from their small village into town, even that in and of itself, for a 6-week skills building training session, how that helped transform their lives, and how then returning to their village with this job that a woman normally doesn't have, and suddenly everybody in the community wanting their new skill and asking the women welders to help them with a job or another, change their stature in their community. So now the women are being employed specifically to help design the projects, the infrastructure projects that we're funding, as welders and plumbers. And I've been just so excited to see them get these jobs. Through another strand of this funding, another set of women, about 60 of them, were trained in a more traditional Abaca Weaving class. Abaca is a plant that is indigenous to that part of the Philippines, and they create ropes out of that, for which they can obtain more funding than they could from just selling the abaca tree itself. And so whereas that is also important as an income earning opportunity, for me it's been in particular the non-traditional skills building courses that I am seeing create a real transformation within these women's lives in terms of their perceptions of themselves, but also the community and husbands' perceptions of them. And so that would be one example of a project that I'm proud of, though there are others that I could cite if you'd like.
No, that's great. One thing that I always am interested in is the property rights and land rights. I think that's always something that we did an initiative a few months ago called Land Matters, which really highlighted the role of that and the effect that owning property and having property rights has on women seems to be an astounding economic growth area. We have another question from the DevX community on this. Sunita, maybe I'll go with you on this one. And this is asking what are the gender policies for the main institutions like UNFPA, World Bank, etc. In terms of, I'm gathering this question is more about internal. So I know that a lot of organizations are trying to increase in order to ensure that they have better programming, increase their hiring of women in their own staffs. Can you talk a bit about what UNOPS is doing in this space?
Yes. Just to clarify, are you talking about trying to have more women working within the organizations, or are you talking about projects?
I interpret this question. This is a question from the audience. I'm interpreting it as, because it's asking what are the gender policies for the main institutions, I'm interpreting it as internal to the...
Okay. Okay. I cannot comment on World Bank and UNFPA because, as you might know, UN is a really large organization and everybody has their own approach. But there is a minimum standard that everyone is meant to follow, and that is the UN SWOP. We have something called a United Nations System-Wide Action Plan led by UN Women, which has specific criteria which are measured for all agencies on a yearly basis to see where each agency stands. So these indicators are available online, and that gives a pretty good idea on where we are. And these indicators focus on two things. One is in the work that you do, and second is on the overall organization culture. So for UNOPS, it would mean two things. How do you mainstream projects, mainstream gender into the projects that we run? And how do you get a better gender balance within UNOPS? So these are the two things that we constantly focus on, and it's also a priority under the UN SWOP requirements. And like I said, each organization have there are areas where they are mandated to work in, and their core area of expertise. So for UNFPA, it would be reproductive health and maternal health and so on. Whereas for UNOPS, it's more of infrastructure and procurement and project management. So within these sectors, I've seen a lot of publicly available gender mainstreaming materials, which has been tailor-made for these sectors that each of the UN agencies have a mandate to work on. So those are some of the ways that we try to integrate gender in both in our work and in our organization.
Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a lot of research out there that's suggesting that
yes.
Not only something you should do from a social perspective, but it's something you should do from an effectiveness perspective, which is have as close of a balance as possible out there, which is great. Now, Mary, I want to go back to you mentioned before, and I want to make sure I get to this, but you pointed out that you wanted to speak to the difference between, or the difference or similarity between equal versus equitable opportunity. Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Sure. The difference is really quite clear. It seems to confuse a lot of people, but it's not confusing, really. Equal means, let us say we provide equal inputs into something. We're going to get all boys and all girls into school, okay? So, and we're going to provide equal inputs in terms of assets and resources and whatever is needed. Now, if you do that, you're going to find that the increase in the number of boys in school is going to be a fairly straight line. There will be a few, curves in the road, bumps in the road along the way, but in the main, it's going to be a straight line, and you're going to be able to achieve that probably if you have sufficient funding. Now, if you give an equal amount of assets or an equal number of assets to getting every girl in school, you're going to find that the route is very circuitous, and an equal amount, an equal number of assets isn't going to do it. You're not going to be able to get every girl in school with the same amount of funding. In fact, if we want to be really equitable in our development work, almost all money would have to go to women. Almost every penny, or real, or Afghani. because equitable means fair. It means, depending on where you're coming from, what do you need to reach the ultimate equality, which is gender equality, right? No country in the world has achieved gender equality. Iceland is the closest, and the Nordic countries are closely behind. I believe the United States actually is 23rd now, whereas last year it was 19th in terms of gender equality. But equitable inputs will never achieve gender equality. So now I have noticed that the word equity is not being used very often. I'm not reading it in the stuff I'm reading lately. And perhaps that's because it's never going to happen. I mean, it's just not going to happen. We're never going to find, you can check equitable, by the way, you can check to see if something is equitable by looking at a budget. That's a very good way to find out where people's priorities are. That's not the only place, but it is one pretty good indication. And it's never going to happen, so perhaps people just stop talking about it, because I'm just not hearing very much about it anymore.
Are the funders talking about it?
Actually, I haven't noticed it. Perhaps that's just being realistic and credible, and and maybe that's the way we need to be, rather than speaking in terms of things that we know can't realistically, practically happen. Mm-hmm. Now, just back to one of your previous questions, I think it's interesting about both institutional equality and programmatic equality. I think that's a very interesting topic as well. We're just discussing it. And the same goes there with equity, doesn't it? It's going to be it's almost impossible in many places to find qualified, a sufficient number of qualified women, which is why there are inputs such as internships and other kinds of creative ways to enhance women's ability to get opportunities, that is internally. In Afghanistan, every ministry is supposed to have a gender policy and a gender strategy. The gender policy at MRRD, which is the Ministry of Rural Reconstruction, Rehabilitation, and I forgot, but MRRD, we speak in acronyms. Its policy is absolutely enlightened. It's one of the best things I've ever read, and I believe they really mean it. And they do speak in terms of both internal and external, institutional and programmatic. Translating it into strategies is very difficult for them, but they're slowly doing it. Now, actually implementing it is the hardest of all. But you need all three. It's just like when you have a mandate, when you have wonderful laws, implementing them, translating them into practice is where the difficulty lies. So you start with the policy, yes, but then I think we need a lot more work done on the implementation and end of things.
Yeah, and I think that this goes back to, in terms of the equitable development funding piece, where most of the funding, even if virtually all of the funding goes toward women and girls, it still doesn't produce equality. It might not get that far. I think that's where it comes down to some of the challenges between integrating men into your gender policies as well. It's because at first glance, if you say that, yes, we're going to give 90% of our development funding toward women and girls, the men in those countries might be offended. But if they realize what that actually means, and some of the fairness behind that and why that actually helps them, it could be more easily taken. Yeah, I don't know if you have if any of you, I'll sort of put this open. We're sort of getting to the end of our time here, but I'll put this open about more of that concept of men being involved in the programs, and how that's best done at sort of the project level, not kind of a theoretical, but project level. Do any of you have comments on that?
Yes, especially in, like I said, in the sectors that we operate in. it is really important that both men and women take this seriously in the projects, in day-to-day activities. The message that we try to tell everybody is gender mainstreaming is not extra work. It is about making sure that you do it in an equitable manner. So for instance, if your road requires 100 laborers to do the routine maintenance, we are not asking you to hire extra 50. We are asking you to make sure that out of 100, at least there is a 60-40 or a 50-50 divide between men and women. So when we try to, the core message that we try to communicate is gender mainstreaming is not an additional burden. It's just making sure that whatever you're doing in a day-to-day basis, you make sure that the benefits are enjoyed by both women and men, in some cases even boys and girls, depending on the type of projects that you do. And we also try to emphasize that gender mainstreaming is a must for sustainable development. So you may or may not be a fan of gender mainstreaming, but at the end of the day, if you want your project to be sustainable in the long run, appreciated by the community, and make sure that the benefits are not skewed, it has to be gender sensitive, and it is not an option, it is a must do if someone is really serious about success of a project. So for instance, you could build 100 kilometers of roads, and you could say that, okay, women are going to use a road, so we are going to call this gender sensitive. And the answer that we say is no, but what have you done for it? Have you made sure there are toilets along the way? Now, that's one of the main reasons women don't travel, especially on long journeys, because there are no toilets. And what about pedestrian crossings? What about road safety? Road safety is the third biggest killer after two major diseases. It's one of the biggest problems that's faced across the world, and oftentimes women and children are usually the victims. So when you're building the road, have you made sure that there is a sidewalk which is safe? And it may sound like common sense, but it's being gender sensitive to a certain extent, because women and children often comprise of a majority of the pedestrians and those in non-motorized traffic. And so if you think of it, it's very engineering, but it is also addressing gender equality issues by making sure even in hardcore engineering and the so-called male-dominated sectors, there are a lot of masculine activities that you can still do to make it more gender sensitive, by making sure that you're building it in such a way that it is accessible and useful by both men and women. You're making a difference to the ultimate success of your project and its intended outcome.
May I add something to that, because I thought that was brilliant, Sunitha. Thank you. That's really perfect. And just a quick PS, or just a quick note to infrastructure projects, since this has been a topic of conversation. Extractive industries, for example, is one of the gold mines, so to speak, in in Afghanistan, and we really want to make sure that women get a piece of that action. And yet people say to me, women don't want to be coal miners, or they don't want to go in there with a pickaxe and a hard hat and do whatever is done down there. And I said, no, of course they don't. But if you think about it this way, how many functions need to take place before you actually get to the mine? How many environmental impact studies need to be done? How much in terms of contracting? How much in terms of, think about it. I actually wrote it down with some engineers, and there were like 15 functions that needed to be accomplished before that point. And the same with afterwards. Now, I don't think women want to wear hard hats and go down there. I don't know, maybe some do. I wouldn't, but some might. But women can certainly do everything, every other of those functions if they're properly trained. So just another word on the infrastructure work that I'm so pleased to hear that is being done.
Yeah, and I think that's great. And I think that giving that reason, having these these reasons why it's important to do these things that Mary just said and that Sunita just said is important to get everyone involved into the process, and that's of course part of the mainstreaming of it. I think that we're about time, but I'll leave. I'll just stay quiet for a few seconds. If anyone has any final thoughts about mainstreaming gender into development projects or anything else we've discussed.
Could I just add one thing, which I didn't get to speak about, and I think there's the value of creating policies and tools and guidance, but the only way that these are really going to be implemented if there's clear accountability, resources, and staffing set aside to actually make sure that these things happen. So whereas I think we should keep continuing to emphasize policies and tools, we really have to make sure that institutions walk the talk and assign the resources that are needed to implement it. And it's one of the things that MCC has learned about over time. They started by having agenda policy in 2006, which back then I didn't work for the MCC, but I admired it for having had such a policy. And I attended the launch event and thought it was so wonderful to see a commitment. And yet the reality was that the policy was being very unevenly applied. And it wasn't until the institution promulgated its gender integration milestones and operational procedures and really increased its staffing, resources, attention, and accountability to gender that we've seen a really major push towards meaningfully integrating gender, which is what's been happening right now. So that's my final words on the matter.
Well, I think MCC has done a great job, and I think everyone's noticed. So I think that's fantastic. Anything else?
Well, I have a final thought, and that is that when we are involved in integration, from start to finish, from conceptualizing a program to actually implementing it and monitoring it, of course, it has to be done throughout the process, and it has to be done very explicitly. Gender considerations will be considered is not sufficient. And believe it or not, I have seen that written many times. And I would go and say, what gender considerations are you going to consider? Because it's such a ridiculous thing to say. But the point I wanted to make is this. We have to avoid ad hoc programs for women in integrated programs. There has to be a strategic plan for women as well as for men sometimes, if they're not actually doing the same kinds of things or at the same level. You have to have a plan that says, okay, you're going to go from here to here to here to here to here, and then you're going to end up there, and you need to follow it. You don't just come up with a bright idea for women at some point along the way and then do it. There's got to be a very carefully constructed strategic plan that will lead to the destination, the desired destination. And that would be, I think, the best advice I could give anyone.
Great. Well, thank you. And Sunita, I'll give you your chance now, since we're 2 out of 3. You have to have something.
Yes. What I really believe is one of the biggest barrier that we face, I don't know about others, is the mindset, it's about getting people to take it seriously, which is probably the biggest barrier. Like, we can always come up with resources and, with accountability frameworks, but as long as the cultural mindset is not changed, I mean, no one questions the financial rules and regulations, then why do they question about gender? It should be just like any other, a normal business as usual. So if we have delegations of authority says you can sign this one because you're authorized to do so, it's a no-brainer and no one questions it. But when you talk about gender or environment, there are always questions and oh, why do we have to take it? Can we get away without it? No, you cannot. I think that kind of culture needs to be embedded, and it's really difficult. But I've seen it. Getting people to talk about it helps. For instance, in UNOPS, we came out with something called a gender focal point network. Now, what we did is we have 30 main country offices spread across the world, and oftentimes we don't have the necessary critical mass to appoint a full-time gender focal points. So it may not make a business sense from that point and financially be viable to appoint one for each. So what we did was we appointed a champion network. So there are people who also volunteer to be gender focal points to talk about this in their offices, and they do it purely as a volunteer. It's a voluntary mechanism where they talk about it, they attend the interagency meetings, and they talk about this to the project managers, and they talk about it and raise awareness, and that we see really works. When you put a face to it in each office and there is somebody who talks about it and takes it seriously, it's kind of infectious and it spreads around. So that's 2 cents for me, and it's a long way to go.
Yes, it is. So, well thank you, Josefina and Mary and Sunita for joining. And I want to thank everyone in the audience for participating in SheBuilds and following it. We're continuing on for until April 7th. So please go to the SheBuild site and look at all the great content from DevX and also all of our partners in this. And thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.